welcome Neil as he comes up and shares his story with us.
Well, I'm not sure which Neil he's referring to. That was awful nice. I love stories. I love all kinds of stories. I love movies. I have 3 DVRs at my house, so I watch a lot of TV. I love stories. I love music. Music, if you listen to the lyrics, are really stories. But the stories I love most are people's stories. And God has sort of blessed me with the ability to get people's stories out of them. I'm not sure how or why, but for some reason people are pretty open to talking to me. Maybe it's I'm a good listener. I travel a lot for work, and one of the things, I'm a painful extrovert. I hate being by myself. And I get to travel a lot for work, but that means a lot of times I'm eating by myself. And to me, there's nothing more painful than having to sit at a table and eat by yourself. So rather than sit at a table, I will typically sit at a bar. Because A, it's a pretty captive space, and there's usually a bartender that I can, make engage with me. Or B, what I found is if there's another person sitting at the bar alone, they're typically in the same boat, so it's pretty easy to strike up a conversation. To show you what this looks like, I was actually in the Philippines 2 weeks ago, and I was going to this restaurant to see if they would actually carry the NFL game so I could see the game that week. They did not. It was an Irish pub, but I met this lady, and her name's Margaret, and I thought it'd be, and my mother-in-law's name is Margaret, so I thought it'd be interesting if she would say hello, so I want to introduce you to Margaret.
Hi Margaret, I'm Margaret from Nottingham in the UK, living in the Philippines, and I've just met Neil, another American. He's been a good boy, I'll keep my eye on him.
Isn't that great? So not only can I talk to people, I get them to talk on video, which I think is a pretty intense skill. This timestamp on this was 4:30. At 10 minutes later, I find myself in this fascinating conversation with her where she's telling me her family history. I don't know how it happened, I don't even know, but I started, I'm like, wait, I gotta get this on film because my father-in-law, who's really into like Ancestrytree.com and all that, really loves this stuff. So look, I'll just show you just a smidgen of the conversation we had. There it is.
My family, my daughter's on the family tree. On my mum's side, we came from Germany in 1701.
What was her maiden name?
Orson.
Okay.
That's a German name. We came over to London.
I had Orson in my family, O-R-S-O-N.
O-R-T-Z-E-N. On my dad's side, we came from Normandy in France in 1066.
1066.
They took the British throne.
Sorry. Really?
Honestly and truthfully, we came over. Two of my ancestors was with Richard on the 3rd, 4th and 6th Crusade and finished up in prison in France with Richard.
She really didn't understand the whole shut up! Like, I think she thought I was serious. But still, so I was like, uh-oh, got the Brits mad at me again. Here we go. So, isn't it amazing that she's just willing to open up and tell her story like that? Now, look, being fair, that's a pretty cool story, right? Like, she's talking about 1066 and being with Richard during the Crusades, and she goes on, and she carries her family line up to her current cousin, who does something with the Queen, I don't know what, but it was very interesting. But a lot of us don't have that story. My story is not like that. My family didn't come over in 1700. I grew up in a trailer in Northeast Pennsylvania, so I don't have this grand story that I'm willing to share or ready to share. But that's a problem. That's a mistake, because one of the greatest tools God uses is our stories. There's a verse that I love sometimes. It's called, Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you hope in the future. And a lot of people see that verse and it brings them hope. It lets them know, oh man, God knows me. He's got a plan for me. and that gives them encouragement. That verse frightens me to death because I know that for the vast part of my life, I have not followed God's plan for my life. At least I don't believe I have. I didn't know Him until I was 29 years old. And I think a lot of people who love this verse, we think of their plan as looking something like this. A long, straight road, a little curve here and there, but and there's a saying, right? Follow the straight, narrow path. But that doesn't happen for a lot of us in my experience. It certainly didn't happen for me. My road looks something more like this. And if you think, but it really does. And if you think of each of these curves as sort of decision points, I couldn't find a picture that showed like coming to an intersection and going left or right, and a lot of those. But our life is, God gives us free will. It's about these decision points that we make in our lives and what we do with them. Sometimes we're heading forward, we're going down the right path. Other times we make decisions and we end up going backwards. But God will continue to use that. And what I found is that a lot of people want to forget these parts. They want to forget the times where they've made the bad decisions. They want to forget about that divorce. They want to forget about that addiction they have. They want to forget about the anger issues that they have. And although we shouldn't dwell on those, God can still and will use those. So that's why I'm here today to tell my story, why? What's so great about my story? Absolutely nothing. My story is just a story. Just like your story is just a story, just like your kids' stories are their stories. But my story, I'm going to start at the end. So if you were to look at my life, you would think, things are pretty good. Wait for this second. I've got a really nice house. I'm pretty successful in my job. I've been with my company almost 19 years. Make a really good living. I have an amazing, beautiful family. I get to travel the world. I'm actually leaving for the Philippines again tomorrow, so I get to do a lot of great stuff. I have some really cool toys. I actually own the drone that took that picture, so things are really good. But people see that and they kind of just assume like, I must have come from affluence, or I must have had it pretty easy growing up. And it's really not the case. I was born in England in 1970 to very young parents. My mother was 17 when she was married. She married my dad, who joined the Air Force because he got his draft card, and he knew that he was going to be drafted, so he signed up to go to the Air Force rather than getting drafted into the Army or the Marines. He got stationed in Lincoln. She went over after she graduated. She was really lonely, and my mother's road has a lot more of those back curves than most people's, and she's not great at making decisions. But because she was lonely, she didn't have family or friends, she decided the best thing to do would be to go off the pill without telling my father, and here comes Neil. So, my dad told me this one day in a not so great way. I was messing around with my brother in the car, and I'm like, dude, you must have been a mistake. My dad chimed in and goes, no, actually you were. I was like, oh, thanks, Dad. He said, no, it was a good one, and it'll be all right. You can see where some of my issues come from now. But my mother couldn't handle it, so family had gone over to try and help out. She ended up having sort of a mental breakdown, and they shipped them back stateside to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where the day before my third birthday, my brother Jason was born. Things went okay for about a year, and then she tried to hurt herself. So my dad had been in Thailand. He got called into the CO's office to find out what was going on. He was thriving in the Air Force. He was crew chief, loved his job, loved what he was doing, was advancing, getting promoted quite a bit. Got called in the CO's office. 2 hours later, he was on a plane. 48 hours, he was out of the Air Force. Kicked out because of my mom. So there's my dad, now homeless and jobless. So he did the only thing he knew to do, which was to move us back home to Pennsylvania. And he put a 14-foot wide trailer on my grandparents' land. And he went to work for his good friend from high school as a mason. And he had it pretty tough. Things didn't go well for my parents. They divorced when I was 6. The first time that Jason and I ever went to see my mom, we didn't really know what was going on. Jason was only 3 at the time. My mother tells a story about how she opened the laundry room door and Jason was sobbing and I was holding him and I just kept rocking him back and forth saying, it'll be okay, it'll be okay, it'll be okay. The next day, she sat me down and said, and it was probably the moment that I kind of knew how my life was going to be set up. At 6 years old, she said, Neil, you have to decide who you're going to live with, your father or me. And as if that wasn't sort of a grave enough decision for a 6-year-old, she said, and whatever you decide, that's going to affect Jason too. So although I wanted to really live with my dad, I chose to live with her. My 6-year-old logic being, he's a guy, he's tough, he can handle it, my mom will cry. So I decided to live with my mom. Moved in with her a few weeks later. She had been dating this musician who became my stepfather and probably one of the best, most influential men in my life. Things were going pretty well then for a few years. My sister was born when I was 8. Her name is Megan. But after Megan was born, things started declining again. My mother started drinking a lot, doing a lot of drugs, and the fights with Jimmy just kept getting worse and worse to where she attacked him with a knife and he left. And sat down with me the next day for another one of these conversations of, hey, we're getting divorced. You're gonna have to step up. I'm not. You need to take care of your brother and sister. Okay, so I did. I would get them up every morning, get them off to school. I'd pick them up, or Jimmy would come and pick up Megan and take her because she wasn't old enough to go to school yet. But I would walk Jason to school and then I'd wait for him afterwards and I would come home, take care, get dinner sometimes if my mom was around. And I'm not saying this because it's a big deal. There are people in this room that have been through much worse. Anytime I go overseas, I see kids that have it a lot worse. So I'm not up here like, oh, boo-hoo, this is such a horrible story. It's just my story. It's just part of what I grew up doing. One night, I was woken up, right, because my mom was yelling up the stairs. She's like, Neil, the jacket doesn't fit, the jacket doesn't fit, I gotta go to work, the jacket doesn't fit. I'm like, what? So I go downstairs, and there's my mom with no clothes on except for my jacket, which I wasn't always this size, so it didn't really fit well. So I got her a towel, and she was really out of her mind. And it was all I could do to tell her that it was 12:30 at night and show her that it was dark outside and there was really no work. So I did the only thing I knew at 9 years old to do to sober somebody up, so I made her some coffee. She sat down at the table, she drank the coffee, or some of the coffee, and I noticed a bottle of pills. And I remember getting really mad at the pills, because I figured they must have had something to do with this. So I finally got her upstairs, we were walking past my sister in my bedroom, and I could see my brother and sister's eyes, and they were like, what's going on? I'm like, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. Trust me, it'll be okay. I got my mom in her room, got her in bed, and I got a pillow, and I laid down in the hallway outside her door. I was really afraid that she would get up and go out again, was my biggest concern. I must have fallen asleep because then I heard a knock on the floor. And so I woke up and I tried to open the door and I couldn't. I finally pushed the door open to find my mom had collapsed. Her eyes were rolled back in her head. She had overdosed. I went downstairs, I called the police, called her father, I called Jimmy. And I did the only thing I knew to do, which is get the kids ready for school. So the police came and I can still remember my brother and sister sitting on the couch with their jackets on, ready to go, and I'm standing across the room, and they wheel my mother in between them. What I remember, oddly enough, is they were sitting on the edge of the couch, but they were so small, their feet were dangling. I just remember the dangling feet for some reason. I just told them it'll be okay, it'll be okay. And then the weirdest thing happened. Everybody left. Like the police left, the ambulance left, it just left me and the 2 kids. I'm like, well, this is bizarre. So we ended up going to school that day. That day we came home, and my aunt, her sister was there, Jimmy was there, and my grandfather was there. And we packed our bags, and it was the last time I ever lived with my brother and sister again. I went to live with my aunt. My brother went to live with my father's parents, whose land his trailer was on. and Megan went to live with Jimmy. Finally convinced my family to let me live with my dad, so I could be closer to my brother. My dad was working 3 to midnight, so I pretty much grew up from 9 to teenager by myself. Although my grandparents were there, I was pretty responsible. Got a job when I was young, did pretty well in high school. Didn't really have much contact with my mom. She had remarried again and did a real jerk. But I kind of cut ties. My family got really mad at me for cutting ties with her. And she ended up getting sick of diabetes, and they blamed me. They said, well, she's stressed because you're not in her life, and you need to be in her life. And I had signed up to be an exchange student, so I was gonna go away. And I said, you know what? I can go visit her a few times. I'm gonna be gone for a year, what's the big deal? So I started going to visit her, and things were actually going pretty good for her. She just bought a house, a double wide trailer, and they were moving into it. And I remember it was a summer day about 3 weeks before I left for Ecuador, and I was painting the skirting of my dad's house. And my grandmother called, and she said, Neil, you need to get to the hospital. She'll beat up your mom pretty bad. So I go down to the hospital, and I get off the elevator, and I see my Aunt April. And it's one of those things, like you see somebody that's someplace they're not supposed to be and they're out of context. And I looked at her and I smile. I'm like, oh, Aunt April. And I could just see something was terribly, terribly wrong. And she's talking to some lady that was in bad shape. And she kind of put her hand up to her mouth. And the lady turned, and it was my mother. They had started celebrating their new house by having Bloody Marys at about 8 o'clock in the morning. By 1, they had finished off a couple bottles of vodka, convinced their neighbors to take them someplace to buy a picnic table. On the way back, they got into an argument. She hit him. The argument spilled into the house where somehow he wound up on top of her, ripped 60% of the hair out of her head, and he hit her so hard that the entire side of her face, she broke 11 bones in her body, her eye socket was smashed, and her eye actually fell into her cheek. It was, I didn't even recognize it. It looked like she got hit by a truck. But, you know, there was a blessing here. She finally realized that there was a problem. The doctors got her into the #1 rehab facility in the state. The problem was she couldn't get there for 30 days. So she went to live with my aunt for those 30 days. After about 2 weeks, she calls, and we're kind of excited. I'm like, okay, this is gonna be a good thing. She'll finally get her life on track. So she goes, she's calling me, and I can hear somebody in the background, and it's her husband. I'm like, where are you? She says, I'm home. What do you mean you're home? You're supposed to be going to the hospital. She said, I don't need that. That's for drugs. That's not me. I'm better than that. That was one of the last conversations I ever had with my mother. Coincidentally, she died last year on Mother's Day. I left for Ecuador, came back, graduated, went to Pitt. And at Pitt, I had a lot of those backsliding things where I was not living anywhere near a godly life. I was joined a fraternity. There was a lot of everything that goes on with the fraternity, a lot of women, a lot of things I shouldn't have been doing. But I really realized I was going down a bad path. So I joined the Marine Corps. One of the Marines loved it, actually, was an honor graduate out of boot camp and MP school. I started to get things going well for myself. One of the things I found interesting about college was people were really willing to talk, really about anything. And I would talk about religion whenever I could, because we grew up Catholic, sort of. Like we would go on Easter and Christmas, but I did my first Holy Communion. If any of you were raised Catholic, you know what that is. You go to class, you have CCD classes, which is 10 weeks or something like that. You learn about the basics of Christianity, I guess, and then you are able to take communion. And you have to go to confession. That's kind of a big deal. But I didn't really understand it. I remember we were walking into church. It was a gorgeous day, and I was just really confused. And I asked my mom. I said, "So, let me get this straight. So Adam named all the animals, right?" She's like, "Yeah." I said, "Well, what about the dinosaurs? Why didn't he talk about dinosaurs?" Every 9-year-old loves dinosaurs. So my mom gets this panic look on her face. Well, just then, the priest is walking across the street. The parish home was across the street from the church. And she says, "Oh, Father Mick Irish something. Hey, come to see Neil." And he comes over and says, "Neil has a question for you." So I asked him, he says, "Oh, Neil, let me explain something to you. The Bible," see, they didn't have a lot of good science back then. So the Bible is really a book of stories for them to explain things they didn't understand. Oh, okay. Fair enough, sounds completely plausible. I bet that priest had no idea that that would impact my faith for the next 20 years. Because now I had no foundation for a faith. I was always a seeker. I was always afraid of what would happen to me when I died. I still kind of am. But I was okay with there not being a God and it just being like, oh, eternal sleep, no big deal. And that was a great theory, and I lived off that for years until a guy in college really kind of wrecked it by saying, "You know what? You're brain dead when you're asleep, when you're dead, so there's no dreaming." So panicked me. So I started studying anything I could. I studied Scientology, I studied Buddhism, I studied Hinduism, Mormonism. If there was an ism, I was studying it. I married Hope's mom, and we moved to Virginia. And Hope was 2 years old, and her mom grew up Catholic in a very, really great Catholic home. And she asked me one day, she said, "Do you believe in Jesus?" I said, "Well, yeah, I mean, I guess there was a person, Jesus, right? I mean, as a historical person, but I don't believe he was the Son of God." She says, "Really?" I said, "No, I don't think she's the Son of God. He was the Son of God." As a matter of fact, I don't even know if there is a God. Which is odd for two things that we're actually having this conversation. Number one, we've been together for 6 years and never had this conversation. We were married with a 2-year-old daughter, and it just had never come up. So she started taking me to all these churches around Richmond. And really, pretty much all the churches that we visited were just proving her point. They were either like, you turn in, you walk in, and everybody would be looking at you like, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Just not very welcoming. Or they'd be all charismatic and hugging up on me. So after about 2 months ago, she realized that she wasn't going to do that anymore. It was really just ruining her case. So she started wanting to investigate churches on her own. She found a church that was meeting in Springfield Elementary School. And she really liked it. She kept going back. And I kept noticing there was a difference in her. When she'd come back, she'd be in a better mood. She was nicer to me. So like, then they start calling. And they start coming to the house. So I'm like, okay, you got involved in some kind of cult. So I went to save her from the cult. That's exactly what I told her. That morning, there's a half of the amount of people that are in here in the church. The pastor gets up to speak, and he says, "We never do this here, but I just want to talk about, we had the largest offering we ever had. It was over $8,000. And I'm like, "There's only like 50 people. I'm like, that's ridiculous." And I'm like, "Okay, here's another church just talking about money." And he says, "I'm just so proud of what we're doing here." He says, "I know a lot of people think we're a cult." And I get an elbow in the side. And now I'm thinking, okay, she's completely set me up for this. But I like the music, I like the message. So I started going back, and I signed up for this class called Alpha, which was a class about being able to ask questions. All questions were welcome. And after about 2 months, I got saved. I jumped into church, and my life had completely changed. I was successful at the time. I had a house. I wasn't one of those stories where I had to hit rock bottom before I found Christ. Christ was always there. And I remember the morning that I accepted him. It wasn't an audible voice that I heard, but I had this feeling like his hand on my shoulder saying, "It's okay. It's okay." Just like I used to tell my brother and sister. My life has been wonderful ever since. I've had problems. I've been divorced. But the thing that always keeps me going is now that verse that, yeah, I may take those switchbacks and I may make mistakes, but I get to tell my story. I get to live a life that's so much fuller. My brother married very young, like my father, went to the Air Force like my father, got kicked out of the Air Force, unlike my father. He got out because they were trying to send him overseas, so he got a medical discharge. He married his wife, they moved into a trailer. He had 3 kids because that's how they solved their marital problems. He started drinking really heavy, and his body never could tolerate alcohol. He developed pancreatitis, and he didn't manage it very well. So after 5 years of dealing with that, actually 5 years ago today, 2 weeks from now, doctor's appointment on Monday. I talked to him on Friday, and he had been struggling. He had just got out of rehab, and he was sounding really good. He's like, Neil, he says, I think I can move out of my grandmother's. He had moved, his wife kicked him out, and he was living in the same room he grew up in my grandmother's house. He says, I think I've got something to offer. He says, I'm only, what was he, 37 years old. I said, yeah, man. I said, I'd love to talk to you about that. Let me think about that for a minute. Because he was kind of taking care of my grandmother and things. Well, Monday comes, I call him, there's no answer. I get a call Wednesday. Tuesday night, he had got up. My dad was driving a truck and got home. He went up into his room, sat under his bed, grabbed my dad's pistol, took his life. My sister, she has not fared much better. She got pregnant very young, married the father, kind of went through an episode similar to my mom's and just left. We didn't know where she was for about a year. Came back to the town, hooked up with the rowdy crowd. She got arrested for growing a whole bunch of drugs in her basement. She has lost her kids. We are closer now than we ever have been. But I try to use my story to tell them, like, hey, there's better. I don't know how I escaped it, and they weren't able to. But I thank God for it. And I pray for her every day. I pray for all my family. And I pray for all of you. I pray that you will look back at your story, and someday you'll tell somebody. When I came back from burying my brother, we were in the theater. I was packing up. I was on the teardown crew. One of the guys that I'd known for years came up to me, and he said, I know what you're going through. I said, oh yeah. He says, yeah, I killed my brother in a hunting accident. And we talked, and his story affected me so much. He said, I never really talk about this. And we don't talk about these things, but be open to your story. We're going to do an exercise in Joe Group this week, because God will use it. It doesn't have to be a hard story, but it's your story, and God will use that story. The greatest story in the world is Jesus' story, right? That is the best story ever. And every week at Velocity, we celebrate that story by taking communion together. And you don't even have to go to CCD class, isn't that awesome? Well, it's funnier than that. We get to celebrate the fact that there was a God that loves our story. A God that knew every time you were going to pick the wrong path an eternity before you picked it, and He chose for you to be born. Think about that. He knew every mistake you were going to make before you made it, and He still made you anyway. We get to worship a God like that. We get to serve a God like that. And we take this communion to celebrate not that He died.